research had the very ambitious goal of trying to obtain the holy grail of investment, which is predicting price movements, which, as we know, is nearly impossible. But in the process, I got some very interesting insights, which I'll share with you today. So I'll start off just providing an overview of what others have done in the past and how they've approached this problem. I'll then describe a new data source, Telegram Messenger, which I've used, and then how I extracted sentiment and developed a model for price prediction. Now, the literature makes it pretty clear that the fundamentals of a network, particularly its size, the number of users, as a pretty good indicator of price evolution over the long run. So by long run, I'm talking about months and years. However, I was more interested in short-term movements. And for that, search volumes and sentiment proved to be quite good indicators. Search volumes, Google Trends is the obvious place to find those. Whereas for sentiment, you have two options. You can either go for Twitter, which has a huge amount of data, but a very low signal-to-noise ratio, or look at online news sites and cryptocurrency discussion forums. We have more focused discussions, but it's harder to obtain that data. Now, for those of you who have not used Telegram, it's a platform similar to WhatsApp or WeChat, and it's become very popular with cryptocurrency investors. Now, it differs from those other platforms in a couple of ways. Firstly, it's not owned by a tech giant. It also has the ability to host groups of up to 100,000 users, which can get pretty chaotic, but because it also offers pretty sophisticated bots, the admins of those groups can manage those discussions pretty effectively. So this had not yet featured in the literature, so I decided to incorporate this in my research. The main tools used for price prediction in the past were linear econometric models, and more recently, gradient boosted trees and long short-term memory recursive neural networks proved to be pretty good at this job, so I used the latter in this research. The general observation is a lot of studies in the past have used either daily or weekly data. So you have this really sparse data set of over the course of a year, you maybe have a few dozen or a few hundred data points. And that makes it really difficult to train a model. So I addressed this by using real-time or hourly data at the lowest possible. That's the lowest frequency data I used. So this created a much richer data set for doing this analysis. On the right-hand side, you can see a diagram of how cryptocurrency investors interact with the market and with each other. And I pulled data from several of these channels. The price data I got from CryptoCompare, and the search activity from Google Trends. So specifically, I tracked the hourly popularity of the phrases Bitcoin and Ethereum respectively over the course of several years, and the price data I got since inception for Bitcoin and Ethereum. Now turning to the new data source, Telegram, it has a pretty good API, and the problem is you have thousands of these discussion groups, and it's pretty unstructured. So I used the process of elimination to find groups that are large enough to produce a good amount of data, and are also quite focused on the topic at hand, because a lot of these groups are a combination of technical discussions in terms of technology as well as the market. So having followed this process of elimination, I ended up with two groups. The one is a Bitcoin group called the Whale Club, and that had 30,000 members producing 2,500 messages per day. And the Ethereum group called F-Trader was smaller and produced fewer messages, but between them I collected 1 million messages to mine. The next step is sentiment extraction. The tool of choice was called Vader. It's an open source Python library. It's quite popular in the social sciences, and it's really good at extracting sentiment from everyday discourse. But as we can see in the red, it really fell flat when it had to analyze crypto-specific phrases as well as financial phrases, because it just used a standard dictionary. So I created a custom dictionary assigning weights to these kind of phrases that come up often in the chat. And here we can see in the green column, the scores are more intuitive. And just as a point of reference, Vader gives a range of -1 to +1 sentiment. -1 being most negative, +1 being most positive. So, phrases like Lambo and HODL do come up a lot and do have a lot of meaning on these chats. So the next step was to do some pre-processing, and I followed all the normal steps. But two of the key pre-processing steps I'd like to draw your attention to. The first one is smoothing. When you collect hourly data, especially in financial time series, it's incredibly noisy. So on the top right, you can see it is just all over the place. So it had to be smoothed quite a bit for the signal to emerge from the noise. And weekly smoothing seemed to be the optimal amount to apply. Seasonality was also prevalent, interestingly, both in cryptocurrency trading volumes. People have preferences to trade at certain times of the day and certain times of the week. And also sentiment and activity on the chat. So on weekends, people are more optimistic than during the week, etc. So all of that had to be normalized for. And it's amazing how seasonal all activity in the crypto community was. Right, so before building the model, I took one last step, which was to look at these individual time series, pre-processed, cleaned up, and just see how they relate to this price that I'm trying to model. And I did this for a period of 7 months. Now, I had substantially longer data, but unfortunately, this was the only period that I had high quality data for for both currencies and for all time series, just to make sure it's comparable. So that gave us about 5,000 hours of data to mine. All right, now if you start here on the left, the red is the Bitcoin price, and blue is Google Trends popularity. And this is for the first 2 weeks in the period. So we can see as the popularity of the word Bitcoin rises and falls, so does the Bitcoin price. And this is kind of what we expect based on the literature. So there's a positive feedback cycle. If Bitcoin is rising rapidly, it's in the news, more people search for it, and more people buy Bitcoin, driving its price up further. So there's a positive feedback loop there. However, very interestingly, by the end of the period, which is June 2018, the relationship had inverted completely. And it looks like it's still a positive correlation, but that's because I've inverted the graph. So now we can see as the price crashes, the interest on Google Trends rises. And the correlation goes from positive 0.72 to negative 0.86. And that's with obviously very low p-values. So it highlights two things. Firstly, this assumption in all the previous research that, or the implication that there's a long-term consistent positive correlation between news popularity and price simply doesn't hold when there's a crisis of the magnitude that we saw in the market in 2018. And secondly, it shows one of the weaknesses of using such a crude measure of sentiment, because Google Trends tells you if something is in the news or not, but not whether it's in the news for positive or negative reasons. So for that reason, we moved to a more sophisticated source of sentiment. And this is the sentiment extracted from the Telegram chat. So I took those million messages and blocked them into hourly blocks and calculated the average sentiment per hour. Now here we can see, again, Bitcoin price is in red and sentiment is in blue. So there's a fairly clear correlation. This is for a 2-week period at the end of June, and the positive correlation remained throughout the period. So it did not invert the way Google Trends did. And one of the neat things about Vader is you can decompose your sentiment into separate positive and negative sentiment. And I did that and found that negative sentiment, shown in blue here, is much more closely correlated to the market than positive sentiment, which lagged price by a few hours. And this shows that I think investors are much more vocal and have much more of a knee-jerk reaction when it comes to discussing their fears than it is when discussing positive topics, such as when they've made a good trade. So this shows promise as a time series that could be useful in the model. Lastly, I also collected, just out of interest, the frequency of messages on the chat. So this is the number of messages per hour, regardless of content, that appeared on the chat. And unfortunately, this dotted gray line is slightly faint. I hope you can still see it. That's the original time series, and it didn't have a very strong, clear relationship to price. But when I lagged it by 1 week, exactly 168 hours, it coincided very closely with the peaks and troughs of the market. And this is quite rare that you find in financial time series something that so clearly predicts a price with such a long lead time. Left-hand side, I ran models for Bitcoin and Ethereum separately and tested several periods, but for the most part, 5 days to 1 week was the optimal prediction period. The time steps is the number of inputs in the LSTM model, number of neurons, and then the training set was the first 5 months of the model, December to April. Validation is May, and test is June. And here we're interested in the accuracy of the test set when the model predicts price movements for all of June 2018. And this baseline model just used price and volume. It was meant to give 50% accuracy. Oddly, it does give better than random results, which is somewhat concerning. Well, not concerning, but it indicates that it's a fairly mature market, because in most mature markets you wouldn't be able to get anything above 50% with such a simple model. But the point of this is to serve as a baseline against which to compare the other models. I added Google Trends as an input, and it showed that for Bitcoin there wasn't much of an increase. And this is what we expected, because the Google Trends data had inverted during the period, and that's a pretty bad sign for input variable. Ethereum, oddly, predicted very accurately, and it appears the LSTM model seemed to take account of that dynamic. This 85% accuracy is a bit higher than I feel comfortable with, so I did additional analysis, which I'll get to a bit later. Finally, I removed Google Trends and added Telegram, and here we can see for Bitcoin there's a very big jump from low 60s to mid 70s accuracy, and the F1 and precision is also pretty strong. So Ethereum, on the other hand, because of the weak quality of the Ethereum chat and the low number of messages, it really didn't do any better than the baseline model. It highlights that for Ethereum, the Google Trends still is a good predictor, and for Bitcoin, the Telegram really did improve the model. I did some additional out-of-sample testing, and this was taking the model which predicted to the end of June and predicting another 2 months ahead to July and August without touching the model. So we see those original numbers in red. The test accuracy for July and August really dropped for Bitcoin, but surprisingly held up right for Ethereum. And then the last column is with an asterisk that denotes that I retrained the model. So as I walk the model forward, I use the previous test set as the new training set and sequentially move the model forward over time, retraining it. And that seemed to improve some of the results. Most of these concerns, though, could be addressed by just using a simpler model with fewer neurons and fewer time steps, because the initial results, which we see there, are not as impressive as the more sophisticated models, which potentially overfit somewhat, but they generalize much better over time as you introduce new data, different market conditions. So the lesson here is retraining the model and keeping it simple is a fairly good way of making sure this model adapts to market conditions over time, or at least can manage various market conditions. So where does this leave us? We've shed new light on the relationship between Google Trends and Bitcoin. And interestingly, it still works really well as a predictor for Ethereum, and I think that may require a little bit more work, given the unstable relationship. But Telegram really proved that it does both when mapping it out and doing the correlation analysis, as well as when running the model, that it's quite good for predicting Bitcoin prices over periods of a week. And this data set that I built, as well as the custom prediction, could be potentially useful for future research. The natural users of this research would be investment professionals, but I would caution against anyone using this model blindly, because LSTMs are very opaque, and you could get in big trouble if it makes a trade that you don't understand the logic behind why the LSTM developed it. So I think in practice, a simpler model using the same data would be much more practical. For instance, a gradient boosted tree. Regulators may also find this useful by checking the Telegram chats, which really have a mass of data that's very valuable. That could be used for detecting insider trading and market manipulation in cryptocurrency markets. future work, the model, as we saw, the performance really varies over different time periods. So having a multi-state model that selects different models for different time periods could really improve the generality of this model. And it would be interesting to see whether these same results hold up for different cryptocurrencies and time periods. And lastly, because even though this can be used, these new data series can be used to predict cryptocurrency prices over the period I investigated, that does not mean causality exists. So a formal causality analysis should be good for getting a sense of what really drives or what direction causality runs in. I'll leave it there. Thank you, and look forward to your questions.